And a top story at 6:30, the South African Human Rights Commission is hosting a two-day national hearing on racism and social media in Braamfontein, Johannesburg. The purpose of the hearing is to arrive at an understanding of what constitutes racism in the context of social media and who should be held accountable and to what extent. This decision comes after several incidents of racism on social media that have been reported in the media and have caused uproar in the country. The SAHRC says it received 505 race-related complaints from 2015 to 2016. Social media is increasingly cited as a location for race-based complaints. The SAHRC says recent incidents on social media illustrate the urgent need for intervention. And let's take a look at some instances of recent racist rants on social media to understand what the hullabaloo is all about. KwaZulu-Natal South Coast Estate Agent Penny Sparrow prompted a mass reaction on social networking sites when she called New Year's Day beachgoers monkeys. And days later, economist Chris Hart came under fire for tweeting that 25 years after apartheid ended, the victims are increasing along with a sense of entitlement and hatred towards minorities. And Rian Lucas stoked anger when he mocked the death of former Springbok captain Joos van der Westhuizen. Lucas posted a meme which depicts Spider-Man actor Tobey Maguire grinning with the caption, "Me when I hear a white man has died. Rest in peace, Joos." And Rhodes Bus 4 activist Ntokozo Nqwabe bragged on Facebook that he and a friend made a white waitress cry typical white tears. They gave her a note which read, "We will give you a tip when you return the land."
The Commission hopes that this hearing process will actively contribute towards this vision, and we remain committed to our mandate to monitor the advancement of substantive equality as envisioned in our Constitution. Indeed, there is much work to be done.
The manifestations of the racism are different. Before, it came from the law, it came from the Constitution, it came from official power. Now the manifestations are very different in their quality. So that's the one dimension. The other is social media. Quite extraordinary. Like racism, capable of enormous mutations and evolution.
We bombarded daily by social media posts of hate speech and racial discrimination where hateful and hostile posts go unchallenged. Racism and xenophobia has become a byproduct of lackluster attitude of social media operators towards this abuse. Now, the South African Human Rights Commission is hosting a two-day national hearing to understand what constitutes racism and who should be held accountable. Joining me in studio is Gershua Brooks, Communications Coordinator at the South African Human Rights Commission, and Dirk Visser is a social media expert who will join us on the line. And you at home, as always, the lines are open on 011-542-2486. That's 011-542-2186. I beg your pardon. Hello, Gershua, and thanks so much for joining us. I mean, if we still have to sit with defining what racism constitutes, particularly in a diverse and unequal society like South Africa, does that mean that research is required, or who defines what racism is?
Look, I think we do have a clear definition of what would be racism, within the broader definition, and I think the courts have given us that particular definition as well as the Constitution, right? Mm-hmm. I don't think that is the sticking point. I think what the issue is that how do we deal with the upsurge of racism and the comments linked to racial discrimination and other forms of discrimination via the social media. Yeah,
and I think, Dirk, what we also need to unpack is the contributors or the triggers to racist rants that we've seen on social media. If you take it back to the fact that the predominantly black who are dispossessed are still being abused, not only economically, would you say that that also fits into the mix?
You know, racism is such a terrible thing and such a horrible reality in South Africa. And unfortunately, what plays a huge part is that it's the same as road rage. People claim anonymity. So it's easy to get behind the wheel of a car and start shouting and swearing at somebody because you know there's not going to be any consequences. People take the same approach on social media, and I think it is vitally important that the HRC start including this into their mandate, because people need to be taken to task for the hurtful and hateful things that they say online. And it goes across the board. We've seen it from the research that I've done. We've seen racism in various different races in the country.
Gosholan, I mean, it is across the board, as Dirk is saying, but there seems to be a tendency to want to defend racist posts, where some might say it's just bigotry, it's not necessarily intended to discriminate against a particular ethnic group.
Very true. And the other popular defense that people use is freedom of expression, because it's a right that we're given within our constitution. But what they fail to mention is that even within the constitution and other enabling legislation, that there is a limit to the particular right in question. So it doesn't extend to, as Dirk very eloquently highlighted, it does not extend to hurtful, harmful expressions, and in some instances an incitement against a particular group.
But Dirk, how come in South Africa we haven't seen the global movement #Black Lives Matter in response to police brutality, especially in the interest of social cohesion, that social media can be used to deal and eradicate racism effectively?
It's a very powerful tool, and it can be used to eradicate racism effectively. The problem is that social media as a whole in South Africa is still very new and very young. And as your guest quite rightly said, people don't understand that the freedom of expression doesn't mean that you can say what you want. So we need to get to a point where, yes, we can say Black Lives Matter and actually mean it. And it doesn't matter if you're black, white, or Indian or colored within this country. We realize that there's a need for awareness around this issue, and everybody can join together and move this issue forward. The problem is that we're still working in silos. I don't like you because I am. And that kind of goes against the whole process or the whole concept of Ubuntu, which I think people need to start applying online. Just because you have an opinion doesn't mean that you have to share it. It's the same as standing in a group of people. You don't say inappropriate things because people will take you to task in that. And people have to realize that social media is exactly the same way. As soon as you make a statement, people are going to hold you accountable for that statement. And I don't think the users in South Africa are ready to be taken or to be held accountable. And we just need to mature online. That's really the cause of this whole thing.
Yeah, and more often than not, it's a leak or an immature post where we see racism rear its ugly head. But in the case, for example, of Judge Mabel, who had said that, black men find pleasure in rape and all sorts of things, that it was within a context after it was explained that this was a private conversation. There is no such as a private conversation, because you don't know the extent of hurt that you might be enforcing on somebody else.
I think it's a lesson that people learn on a day-to-day basis, and is that there is no such thing as privacy when it comes to an online platform. I mean, people, for example, in their Twitter profiles would say that this is my personal opinion and shouldn't have an impact on the work that I do. But I'm very conscious of the fact that whatever I tweet, inevitably, whether it's work-related or not work-related, inevitably is going to be, will have a bearing on my work, and I could possibly lose my job as a result. And I think that's a very important aspect to take into consideration. But I think going back to what Dirk just mentioned there, about thinking about what you have to say before you do it, I think that, yes, there is truth to that, but I think what's even more true is the fact that we have to reach a stage whereby we really have to think about how we interact with the rights that are outlined within our constitution. So, yes, racist thoughts can't be managed. And we're managing the expression thereof via the social media or in person, but we need to get to a space whereby we don't think like that anymore.
So it's a microcosm of what society generally feels, and you think in the safety of social media, you can then vent your own discriminatory points. But having said that, what does this tell us about society, especially with young people born free who are not supposed to have the hang-ups of apartheid, etc., reflecting a sense of racism? Where does that stem from, Dirk?
It's actually a very interesting trend what we're finding is that not so much the born frees, because the born frees are now at varsity and they've been more socialized. We're looking at the kids that are coming up behind the born frees. These guys are so aware of their social profiles and their digital footprints that they're very careful to get into any sort of online argument. They are very well informed of what's happening in the world, and they know the impact that their posts will have on their future, because most job seekers or job interviewers are looking at their social profiles. The problem that we're having on social media is the 30 to 55-year-old sort of group. So we're talking sort of post-millennial to, the baby boomers. These guys are still, they're the ones that we need to sort of still deal with. The younger guys, I've got full confidence that the younger generation have got a better understanding on how to deal online. The older generation this is all new to them. This is a brand new thing, and now it's just an avenue to be sort of a loudspeaker. I think what we've got to do is the older people have got to listen to the youngsters in this case and say, you know what, maybe I could take a few leaves out of their book and not say everything or post everything or make racist memes, for example. It's that generation that we need to deal with.
All right, Dirk, we're going to take some callers. Shalik in KZN, thanks so much for calling. And Dale in Randburg, we see you. Good evening to you. And what's your question or comment?
Hi, I would like to comment about the proposed hate speech bill. I just want to explain where I come from. I'm a strong Christian and I'm a qualified journalist, and I've also been politically active. I've read about the hate bill, and I just have two comments to make. The first is that on one part, I'm actually quite glad about the hate speech bill, because they say that a person to report hate speech, they don't need witnesses. Now, this can be quite helpful in cases of bullying, say like at school, for example, or in the community, when there are often no witnesses, or even if there are, people don't want to speak up about it. And bullying can affect a person even mentally for the rest of their life, and cause post-traumatic stress disorder and other psychiatric disorders. So in that case, I think it's a good thing. I think it's a bad thing for people like Christians, because it can actually take away from their religious freedom. Because, for example, homosexuals can use it against Christians when they quote from the Bible to say that homosexuality is a sin. And basically, this is essentially a conflict of worldviews. Everyone has a different worldview, and my worldview is that not only is homosexuality a sin, but also the Bible says you've got to expose evil and you've got to hate sin, you've got to stand for the truth in society, and that there are moral absolutes.
Absolutely, Shalik. I'm sorry to cut your word. In fact, this is a conversation I had with my pastor just this Sunday. But we'll vent that with our panelists. Thanks for calling. Dale in Randburg, hello to you.
Hi.
Hi, good evening.
Good day. I would actually like to say that, I feel that the government doesn't belong on the internet. The government doesn't have power to control people over something that's supposed to be free. The internet it's basically an expression of freedom. So how do we prove that the government is fair when the government is a political, entity? For example, it's very political in nature, so it's biased. And
yeah. Sorry.
The second one is, how do we prove that someone hasn't doctored the picture or image to prove that, how there's going to be so much of lawyers involved, that how is this going to be monitored?
All right, let's just give that. Thanks, Dale. Gershel, I suppose the accountability aspect thereof, that there needs to be consequences for these kind of actions. Who needs to take that role? Is it social media operators, or do we, as you cited, rely heavily on rather the Constitution and legalities?
Well, I think if I can just quickly deal with a couple of things that came up in those two calls. So the first thing is, government and authority always regulates what we do on the internet anyway. That's why we have laws in place, for example, that make sure that people don't exchange child pornography. That other, hateful things, incitements against other groups don't occur. That is why it's important that government plays a role. It doesn't mean that we have to stifle freedom of expression. The second aspect to it, and you mentioned that it was your own question to your pastor this Sunday, is, of course, in terms of freedom of expression, the Constitution doesn't want to stop you from being able to believe what you believe. You have the right to freedom of belief, opinion, and being able to be part of a religious group. What we're saying, though, and what the Constitution very clearly says, is that hate speech shouldn't be part of that. Committing a hate crime against another group is what we are guarding against.
But can the two coexist? As Shalik had brought up, in terms of scripture, what it says against all sin and not just homophobia.
No, I mean, I think the best example is what happened recently with the much publicized instance with the Grace Bible Church. If certain Christian groups believe that being homosexual, being transgendered, or whatever the case is in fact a sin, then you can express that. But do you have to go to the extent of denying someone of their dignity by emphasizing the fact that they are worse than animals, or that, animals don't even engage in that type of thing? And that, for me, is really the area that we have to think about. And last but not least, I think a lot of these questions that people are asking is exactly what we want to address as the South African Human Rights Commission through this national investigative hearing on racism in social media.
Okay, we'll come and take a look at your objectives post the hearings. Just your reaction from commentators so far, in that the bill, in a sense, would be criminalizing racism. There's been many calls on that, and also your view on the religious groups versus the constitutionality or the rights that we enjoy as South Africans.
It's an interesting point that Dale brings up, that it's a free system, so we can use it. Now, just because it's a free system doesn't mean that we need to promote oppression. It kind of contradicts itself, by saying, well, it's a free thing, so I can say what I want. Hold on. Hitler was the same in Nazi Germany. He could say whatever he wants, and look what happened there. We've got to take cognizance that the government and legislation on online media is still very new, as I said before. So this step for the HRC to bring it in is the right move. We live in a very free and fair society in South Africa. We've got an incredible constitution that protects the vast majority of the South African public. And just as your guest in studio said, if you're quoting scripture, that's fine. But if you're taking it to the point that because I'm quoting scripture that gives me the right to judge people because of their lifestyles, then we've got a problem. We've got to really just sometimes we just need to stay in our lane. My honest answer to all of this, and it's what I say to many people, is if you wouldn't say it to your mom, don't put it on Facebook. All right? Like that's my golden rule. Keep it to yourself. You need to know that there are consequences, as in the case of Penny Sparrow, as in the other cases that you've mentioned earlier. There are consequences, and people aren't used to having consequences online in South Africa for what they're saying. We need to realize that stuff is being monitored. There are many companies in this country that are looking at online monitoring and monitoring sentiment of posts that are being flagged by this stuff. So, you can say what you like, but know that there's going to be accountability asked of you because of that.
And Gershel, also, how do we, especially in the absence where we validate the experience of a different ethnic group or a sexual orientation where there's high levels of intolerance, can we then effectively deal with racism?
No, we can't, because, I mean, what we're basically saying is the minority, people that are marginalized, people that society do not necessarily extend rights to openly. I mean, South Africa is a perfect example. We have the greatest constitution in the world that extends rights to all those marginalized groups, and yet as ordinary members of society we find it difficult to extend, just simply extending those rights to people by simply making sure that those people have dignified lives, that we don't impinge on their rights. And so it is important that the Constitution plays that role, and that Chapter 9 institutions like the South African Human Rights Commission ensures that we uphold those rights of the minority.
Yeah, and perceived racism. I'll give you an analogy or personal experience where a white elderly lady bumped my nephew of 5 years old, and there were other kids running around. Can one then say that that particular boy was targeted because he's black, or was it a case of this elderly lady being, I don't know, agitated as some people had responded on social media?
It's a very difficult one. There is obviously that thin line in terms of society's response, in terms of what we deem as being racist outright. I mean, I'll give you a typical example. We have many instances where there's white on black or black on white violence. I mean, incidents of road rage, incidents. Recently we have this horrible incident where someone was mistaken for a warthog. I mean, it's difficult innately. Or
even the coffin case.
Or the coffin case. I mean, it's difficult to innately come out and say it is obviously racist, because there needs to be an inquiry there. We need to look at what actually was the motivation behind it. And I think that's the difficulty that we're struggling with, because in terms of social media, if you look at it, people have made up their minds. The trial has happened, and they've judged all those incidents as being innately racist. And yet we don't know that. And I think that is the sensitivity that we're living within South African society. But the importance is, I think we need open dialogue, Cindy. It's about time for open dialogue where we can start addressing these issues so we can close the gap.
Okay, let's take our last caller, Felix in Johannesburg. Good evening to you.
Nelspruit, actually.
Oh, Nelspruit, hello. Good evening.
Thank you so much. Actually, I have a very different take on this. You see, I am black. And I wouldn't take an offense if a white man sees me and says, no, you are too black, you look very ugly, and actually you are like a monkey. Now, I'm not going to take an offense to that. I don't think that is an offense. That is the way he sees me. That is the way he thinks of me. That is the way he feels me in my heart, in his heart. And I really want to know how he feels about me. People don't perish because of lack of insult. They perish because of lack of knowledge. I really want to know what he's thinking about me, so that I can engage with him, so that I can educate him, so that we can be friends, so that we can love each other. If I don't know how he thinks about me, how am I supposed to engage with him?
All right,
that's why I'm saying verbal expression should not be criminalized. You should encourage it, whatever it takes.
So you're saying that there's hypersensitivity to the subject and there's an opportunity to engage further. Thanks for that call. And we have Jerome in Nelson Mandela Bay. Hi, Jerome. All right, we lost Jerome there. Just in wrapping up, Dirk, your parting shot in how we deal more sensitively with issues of racism on social media.
I've said it again, and I've said it a number of times on your show. You know, we need to really consider every word out of our mouth when we're dealing with a topic that we know that's sensitive, specifically in South Africa. So whatever race you are, you need to look at the post. My advice, write the post, type it up, look at it, walk away from your computer screen, come back and say, you know what, would I be proud if I saw one of my kids posting this? You know, we get very quickly into reaction, but we need to put a lot more thought into what we're doing. It needs to be a more calculated approach to social media in this country. And as your guest rightly said, we need to open the dialogue. It's time now that South Africa moves forward and says, you know what, we're all one, we're all pulling this cart in the same direction, let's work together as one. If you want to post racist comments and do all of that, keep it offline. Rather shout at your wall in your house, keep it offline, because people need to know that they're going to be held accountable, and they can be tried in a court for posts that they've put online, because it can be considered hate speech.
All right, Dirk, we're going to have to leave it there very briefly, Kishore. What do you expect to come out of these dialogues?
Well, what we hope to achieve with with the hearings that we're hosting at the moment is obviously to look at what are the practicalities. We've had a number of organizations, civil society, government, as well as private individuals contributing to this. I mean, today, the Freedom of Expression Institute spoke about the issue of freedom of expression. The police indicated that this, what does it take to actually prosecute these matters? It's obviously an important consideration. So there's a long list of issues that we're looking at, and then we can see how do these different players come together for a particular solution. One that goes beyond just saying that keep it out of the public domain. It's a case of how do we deal with racism as a society.
All right, we're going to leave it there, Gershwell. Thanks so much. That's Gershwell Brooks, Communications Coordinator at the South African Human Rights Commission. Dirk Visser is a social media expert. And thanks for your calls as well. We'll take a quick ad break and we'll be back just after this.